The first volume in the Harry Potter franchise, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, was published in June 1997, and it quickly set off an international cultural phenomenon. At the time, most children spent their leisure time playing video or computer games, watching TV, and pretty much any activity other than reading. This wasn't due to a lack of children's books. Far from it. If you had wandered into a library in the late 90s and early 2000s and perused the children's section, you would have been greeted with a lot of children's series such as The Little House on the Prairie, Nancy Drew, The Babysitter's Club, a series of unfortunate events, and even some fantasy series like The Chronicles of Narnia, The Spiderwick Chronicles, and His Dark Materials. But there was something about Harry Potter in particular that just sparked the imaginations of children, reigniting interest in reading in a generation that had basically abandoned the practice. This series was not only the entree for many young people into the joys of reading, but also many people's first experience in the realm of urban fantasy. Broadly defined, urban fantasy is a fantasy story set in the modern contemporary world, as opposed to high fantasy like Lord of the Rings or the Chronicles of Narnia, where the story takes place in a fictional fantasy world totally separate from the world we live in. For the generation who grew up reading Harry Potter, a lot of the characteristics of the urban fantasy genre were inexorably tied up with Harry Potter in their minds. The idea of having a hidden magical world invisible to the larger world, the struggle against a dark lord, and the need to protect the larger world from the evil machinations of the magical world all felt like new themes to this audience and original to Harry Potter. It was really common to hear fans say that they kept rereading the books because no other series came close in quality. While there was a new appetite for children's fantasy, all the previous archives already in existence and all new attempts to meet this demand fell flat in the face of the Potter legacy. Enter Rick Riordan, a middle school teacher living in San Francisco in the 90s and early 2000s. As a teacher, Riordan was in regular contact with children and knew better than anyone exactly what these books meant to kids at the time. He'd hear them talk about what their Hogwarts house was and all that fun stuff, but he also listened to their laments about nothing being as good as their beloved HP. Having spent hundreds of hours talking and interacting with 11 to 13-year-olds, he knew better than most adults how kids talk, how they think, and what they find to be funny and entertaining. He had writing experience, but he'd previously only written mystery novels for adults. The idea to write a children's book series came after having spent months telling ancient Greek myths out loud to his dyslexic son, Haley Riordan, who has since become a writer himself, fun fact. When Rick ran out of stories to tell him, Haley suggested that he make up some new stories. Rick created the character Percy Jackson as a kind of stand-in or insert for Haley, allowing him to be the hero of the story. He took the learning disabilities his son struggled with and turned them into harbingers of godly lineage. Sure, he might not be able to sit still in a classroom, but those same disabilities can be advantages in a different situation. Rick has since stated that he created the story to empower his son, empower any child with learning difficulties. Using the available back catalog of Greek myths, monsters, gods, and characters, he crafted a story about a modern boy living in a fantastical hidden world within our world, and his many battles and adventures. Considering the cultural moment in which it was published, it's perhaps unsurprising that the first book in the Percy Jackson series, The Lightning Thief, was marketed to the public as the American Harry Potter, or the New Harry Potter. Attaching oneself to the Potter legacy seemed like a great way to get young readers interested in your product, but it turned out to be kind of a double-edged sword, because if people perceive your product as too similar to another thing that they like, there's always a chance they'll disparage it and call it a ripoff. And, no points for guessing what happened. Now, I'm going to be totally upfront about the fact that I did not read Harry Potter as a child. As I mentioned briefly at the end of my last video, my mom believed that Harry Potter was satanic and would surely lead to children practicing witchcraft. As I got older, she relented and I was able to start reading them when I was around 17 or so. But by then, I think I'd kind of missed that window in my development where I would have found them really amazing, and I thought they were just okay. These days, I think their strength is in the plotting. Things that happen in book 1 have a direct bearing on things that happen in book 7, and the story ties together really well in that way. But I don't think they're the greatest books ever written, and I don't have any nostalgia associated with them. I do have a ton of nostalgia for Percy Jackson though, which I started reading on Christmas Day 2008. I know this very specifically because I clearly remember being in the book section of Target with my mom a few weeks before Christmas when my eyes fell upon the cover of The Lightning Thief, and I picked it up off the shelf and started reading the first few pages. My mom said that if I wanted it, she'd buy it for me as a gift, but I wouldn't be able to read it until Christmas Day. So into the shopping cart it went, and I spent the next few weeks pining for Christmas morning so I could know what happened next. When the day arrived, I stuck Taylor Swift's new album into my CD player and plopped down to read the book and completely ignored my family and the rest of my presents for 2 days. Because of my extreme bias for one of these series over another, I don't plan on talking about which series is ultimately better or worse than the other. Honestly, I don't think it's possible to have an objective opinion about that any more than it's possible to objectively say whether Monet or Van Gogh is a better artist. You can try, but ultimately it'll just end up being a discussion about which one you like better and why, which is a completely subjective conversation. So I don't want to make a video about it because there's nothing really I can say that hasn't already been said. Rather than making a quality judgment about which thing is the better thing, I want to discuss how exactly Percy became stuck living under Harry's shadow, and highlight the nuances and distinctions between the series that often go ignored or unnoticed in favor of more surface-level analysis. So here's your spoiler warning, let's go. Part 1. The American Harry Potter. When The Lightning Thief was published in 2005, the Harry Potter books were still being released, so the manic scramble to replace it had not really begun in earnest. But even before Percy Jackson came onto the scene, there were many blatant rip-offs on the market, most of them being so brazen that they basically kept the exact same story, characters, and even sometimes the character names. For example, the Russian series Tanya Grotter and the Chinese Harry Potter books. Yes, that's really a thing. Many publishers at the time were trying to find their own children's fantasy series that would hopefully reach a similar level of popularity with the ready-made fan base of the Harry Potter franchise. I think it would be fair to assume that Disney Hyperion picked up Percy Jackson in the hopes of it becoming the next pop culture phenomenon. The cover art they designed is definitely reminiscent of the HP cover art, and they made sure to signal boost quotes from reviews of the book that positively correlated it with that series. But while Disney Hyperion was trying to replicate the success of the Philosopher's Stone with Percy Jackson, the general public were reading The Half-Blood Prince, also released in 2005. Imagine all these nearly grown-up Harry Potter fans picking up The Lightning Thief after having just read the dark and complicated Half-Blood Prince and being told that it's just like Harry Potter. It's no wonder so many people thought it was a childish, lazy ripoff of the thing they enjoyed. Claiming that your product is as good as the most popular and successful book series of all time is a lot of hype to live up to, and it was always going to fall short for most people and provoke a lot of emotional reactions from HP fans who would not be able to have an objective opinion on Percy Jackson as a result of the comparison. I think there is compelling evidence that this marketing strategy hurt the popularity of Percy Jackson in the long run. It's not as if they didn't become very successful books, because they did, selling over 69 million copies worldwide. Nice. But that's a far cry from the over 500 million copies of Harry Potter sold worldwide, 180 million of which came from the United States alone. It's also a far cry from the over 100 million copies of the Twilight Saga sold worldwide, for a somewhat more achievable comparison. I do understand why the comparisons were made between these series. Both are stories whose basic structure is that of a mystery book with fantasy elements on top. In each Harry Potter book, there's some mystery that must be solved by the trio in order to defeat the big bad. And oftentimes the trio thinks they know who the big bad is right away and turn out to be wrong. Likewise, in Percy Jackson, there's always a prophecy with vague lines that have to be puzzled out and understood in order for the main characters to succeed in their mission. And sometimes they think they know what a line of prophecy means, only to be proven wrong at the end. So that similarity can make some people wonder if the latter isn't a copy. However, this basic structure was not original to Harry Potter. Those of us who read other mystery series like The Boxcar Children or Nancy Drew will know that these are foundational tropes of the mystery genre. There's always a red herring to distract the reader and characters from the true culprit until the end for dramatic effect. Some believe that combining mystery and fantasy tropes is unique to J.K. Rowling, but that isn't true. Other notable examples that employed the same tactic are Artemis Fowl and Goosebumps. My sense as a reader is not that Riordan was aiming to replicate Harry Potter in particular, as much as he was trying to craft a good story for kids based on his understanding of them and his understanding of Greco-Roman mythology. However, Disney Hyperion, book bloggers, magazines, newspapers, and so on really wanted the public to believe that Percy was supposed to be the inheritor inheritor of Harry's empire. And if that's how the book has been marketed to you, then you're likely to view it with a different lens than you otherwise would. Once the narrative comparison was out there, it was guaranteed to invite endless quality comparisons. People argued why Harry Potter was definitely better for a decade, and now the discourse has flipped, and the opinion that Percy Jackson is better has become more popular, for no particular reason at all. But we still can't escape this endless, pointless, and ultimately entirely subjective debate about which is better and why. And this is a debate that I believe has hampered appreciation for Percy Jackson on its own merits. It's irritated me for years that people insist on reducing this story to its most basic elements and then maintain they're all exactly the same as Harry Potter by completely ignoring all the detail and world building and character development that Uncle Rick did in favor of sweeping generalizations. They'll say stuff like, it's about a character who discovers as a tween that they have magical powers, so it's the same as Harry Potter. The problem with this analysis is that it's pointing to a common fantasy trope and assigning ownership of that trope to Harry Potter, probably because it's the first time they've personally encountered the trope. In A Song of Ice and Fire, Daenerys Targaryen enacts a blood magic ritual to hatch her dragon eggs at the age of 14, discovering she is the only person who can control and ride dragons in her universe. In Sabrina the Teenage Witch, Sabrina discovers her magical powers at the age of 16. This is such a common trope because discovering your magic powers is a great metaphor for coming of age. Magic is all about bending the world and others to your will, about taking the power needed to build or destroy or transform. The process of growing into yourself is very similar. You burn bridges and build new ones, you establish boundaries and create ambitions, you learn when to speak up and when to hold your tongue, when to ask for help, when to take responsibility. If you're writing a sci-fi fantasy story featuring young people, it's really easy to connect these experiences thematically or explicitly in the plot. And Harry Potter does this explicitly, but so does A Song of Ice and Fire, Sabrina, Earthsea, A Wrinkle in Time, and many others. One common way that Percy Jackson and Harry Potter get reduced to their most basic parts in order to compare them is to roughly describe the characters in each main cast. Percy Jackson doesn't have a strict trio the same way that Harry Potter does. It's really more of a duo of Annabeth and Percy with up to 4 other members of the team swapped in from the larger cast in each book. In Book 2, the main cast consists of Percy, Annabeth, Tyson, Grover, and Clarice. In Book 4, it's Percy, Annabeth, Tyson, Grover, Rachel, and Nico. But for the sake of argument, we'll look at the similarities and distinctions between the trio that appears in The Lightning Thief, Percy, Annabeth, and Grover, and the trio that appears in Harry Potter, Harry, Hermione, and Ron. Part 2. The Characters. Before I dive into the particulars of each of these characters, I want to establish some terminology so we're on the same page. In every story, all characters have a narrative role or function. The 2 most important roles are the protagonist, or the main character, and the antagonist, the character working in opposition to the main character. But there are lots of other roles. There's the foil, which is a character whose personality helps to reveal the character traits of someone else, typically the protagonist. For example, Peeta is a foil for Katniss because his kindness and charisma highlights Katniss's coldness and awkwardness. Another narrative function is the confidant. This is the person your protagonist bounces ideas and concerns off of. Katniss usually talks to Haymitch when she's got suspicions about something, and he'll call her out when he feels she's being stupid, forcing Katniss to reassess her options. There's lots more, and characters can have more than one function, but this is all you need to know right now. It's absolutely true that this trio and the Harry Potter trio all share similar narrative roles, but that doesn't mean they share the same characteristics. 2 stories having characters with the same narrative function isn't unusual. All stories have protagonists, it's kind of a requirement, and having foils to your main character is kind of important if you want to establish the personalities and motivations of your characters. If we want to argue 2 characters are similar, we can't just look at their narrative roles. We have to look at their characterizations and actions within the story and draw comparisons from that. So with that in mind, let's take a look at our main trio one at a time. The protagonist. If we look at the basic defining traits of Percy, we do get a lot of similarities with Harry. They're both brave people, they're both very loyal, they're both magically gifted individuals with a particular interest in using their gifts for combat, and both share a penchant for playing the hero, as Voldemort puts it. But if we take a closer look at their personalities, we get a lot of differences. For instance, Both boys have a strong sense of humor, but the manner in which they use it is very different. Harry, like most Brits, is a huge fan of sarcastic humor. He often makes jokes at others' expense and throws shade at his enemies. He typically utilizes humor as a defense mechanism in an antagonistic situation. For example, when Draco offers to befriend Harry and prevent him from associating with the wrong sort of wizard, Harry says, "I think I can tell who the wrong sort are for myself, thanks." And when Professor Snape is giving him a hard time in class, "Yes," said Harry stiffly. "Yes, sir. There's no need to call me sir, Professor." These jokes are a typical pattern for Harry. When he's being put down or bullied, he always responds with sarcasm and snark. Percy, on the other hand, has a juvenile, stupid sense of humor. It's lots of fart jokes, bad puns, and humorously misunderstanding things. He usually makes more jokes in a casual or friendly scenario, with antagonistic jokes being less common, as he prefers making direct taunts in those situations. A great example of some patently Percy humor is when he and Annabeth are talking about fatal flaws in the Sea of Monsters. "My fatal flaw is hubris." "That brown stuff they spread on veggie sandwiches? No, seaweed brain, that's hummus. Hubris is worse." "What could be worse than hummus?" The joke is in Percy misunderstanding a word and then superimposing another thing which seems plausible to him. Because Percy narrates his own story, lots of his jokes are observations within his internal monologue. For example, this lovely chapter opening from The Lightning Thief. In a way, it's nice to know that there are Greek gods out there, because you have somebody to blame when things go wrong. For instance, when you're walking away from a bus that's just been attacked by monster hags and blown up by lightning, and it's raining on top of everything else, most people might think that's just really bad luck. When you're a half-blood, you understand that some divine force is really trying to mess up your day. Another huge difference is in the motivation behind these two characters' penchant for playing the hero. Harry is constantly being told not to get involved, to stay safe, and let the grown-ups handle things. He repeatedly ignores these pleas, putting himself in danger in direct defiance of the authority figures in his life. His desire to play the hero comes from within himself, and he insists upon it even in situations when he could actually get help. This trait is a hugely defining part of the plot of the Order of the Phoenix, where he rushes off to save Sirius without going to Snape for help first. As an adult, Harry literally joins magical law enforcement to keep fighting bad guys after his prophecy has been fulfilled. Percy, on the other hand, would honestly prefer it if the gods or Chiron or anybody else could handle everything for him. He doesn't really want to be the hero as much as people keep putting huge responsibilities on his shoulders and expecting him to just deal. He would never want anyone else to get hurt, but given the choice, Percy would prefer avoiding the conflict entirely. His dream of having a quiet life is what keeps him fighting throughout the Heroes of Olympus series, and it's the reason he refuses to help Apollo in Trials of Apollo. And even in the first series, he only makes the decision to take on the responsibility of saving Olympus because he wants to protect Nico from that burden, because he feels he's gone through enough pain already. If Percy lived in the same universe as Harry and went to Hogwarts, he would absolutely, unequivocally be a Hufflepuff. Yes, Percy is brave, but valor is not his primary impulse. Protecting his loved ones is. He doesn't want to be the hero of the prophecy because he feels destined to defeat Kronos, or because he genuinely believes the gods are righteous actors and defending them is the moral thing to do. He does it to protect Nico, his parents, Annabeth, and all the demigods and mortals. Harry is also loyal to his friends, but I think the fundamental difference between the two is that Percy would rather befriend an enemy than defeat him, regardless of what may have happened between them in the past. Percy befriends Luke and Clarice. Harry would never befriend Malfoy or McLaggen. He would sooner bravely duel them to the death. I think when people compare the two characters, what they're really comparing is the similar narrative circumstances that they both endure, but I don't really see strong threads here either. Like, okay, they're both magical people who discover their own magic as tweens, but that's a genre similarity. Sure, they both lose their parents, but Percy gets his parents back. They both were raised in abusive environments, but Harry lives in one for much longer than Percy does, and anyway, this is not exactly an original story concept. This whole debate is like one of those pictures where the more you look at it, the more you notice the problems until your brain just nopes out and you gotta look away. But this shoddy comparison is still leagues more valid than the next one. The best friend. I'm always really baffled whenever people compare these two characters. Basically, the only thing they've got in common is that they're best friends with the protagonists in their stories. That's it. nothing else. I want to be clear that I am referring to book Ron, not the watery oatmeal that is movie Ron. Ron's personality can best be summed up as funny but mean. He spends a lot of the series putting people down with humor and making them cry, especially Hermione, which makes it super yikes that they end up married, but alright. Sure, great. Ron is very brave, TM, assuming no spiders are involved, and while he knows a lot about wizarding culture, he's the least intellectual member of his trio and depends on Hermione for information more than Harry does. Ron is also kind of aimless. He doesn't know what he wants to do with his life and never develops any ambitions. His main internal struggle is his feelings of inadequacy in comparison with his brothers and Harry, and this is never resolved. His low self-esteem rears its ugly heads right up until the last book in the series and then takes a backseat behind Harry's drama, the irony of which is not lost on me. Grover couldn't be more different. He starts out this jumpy, nervous kid, pun intended. He is a deeply sensitive, gentle person. He's very in tune with his emotions and supernaturally in tune with the emotions of others because satyrs in this universe are empathic. He doesn't usually make jokes, though when he does, they're usually at his own expense. While he depends on his friends for help, he's also someone that they depend on, and he takes his responsibilities as a protector seriously. Grover has his own ambitions totally separate from Percy's arc from the word go. He wants to be a searcher, meaning he wants to quest solo to locate the god Pan, whom the satyrs refuse to believe is dead in spite of legends claiming that he is. Without spoiling anything vital, his ambition is fully concluded by the end of the series. Grover is also canonically older than most of the characters in the story, as satyrs age and develop at less than half the rate that humans do. Grover is 28 in the first book, but he looks and acts like a 12 or 13-year-old. With all that time to gain experience, you'd expect him to have more confidence, but the sensitive and anxious parts of himself are so innate that he never really outgrows them. Despite the many differences here, people refer to Grover as the funny friend in order to make this characterization line up with Ron's, but the humor in Grover's character is mostly unintentional. While Ron goes around making jokes to make his friends laugh, Grover makes his friends laugh by being himself. Like when Grover reveals he's afraid of rabbits. Grover isn't trying to be funny, he's just genuinely fearful and anxious, and this creates funny scenarios organically. Really, if I had to draw a parallel between Grover and any Harry Potter character, it would be Neville, not Ron. Like Neville, Grover struggles to overcome his fears and learn to be brave in the face of danger, real or imagined. But ultimately, he does rise to the occasion and lives up to the expectations made of him as well as his own dreams for himself. But even that comparison is kind of weak. In Harry Potter, Neville often depends on Hermione for help in academic and social situations, and rarely does Neville stand up for other people, let alone himself. While Grover is also somewhat less reticent to defend himself in a social situation, he has no problem standing up for his friends. In The Lightning Thief, when Percy makes a derisive comment about Annabeth, Grover tells him to cut her some slack and says that she's a really good person who struggled with a complicated and difficult life and deserves some understanding. He listens to Annabeth and takes her advice seriously and with appreciation, but I wouldn't describe him as depending on her for help for everything like Neville or Ron do with Hermione. And speaking of Annabeth, the smart girl. The comparisons between Annabeth and Hermione are probably the most common among the trio, and it's easy to see why. Both are intelligent young women who value knowledge and spend a lot of time reading, both assist the protagonist with nearly every mission, both have saved the protagonist's life on many occasions, and both take on the role of explaining things to the protagonist and the audience. But all of this stuff is more or less to do with their narrative role than their characterization. In sci-fi fantasy fiction, there's a trope called the five-man band, which is basically a pre-made character dynamic for a group of protagonists where each character brings a particular skill to the table. If you want to know more about it in detail, you can check out this great OSP video about it, and I'll link that someplace. But in summary, the five-man band includes the leader, the lancer, the heart, the big guy, and the smart guy. Within the PJO universe, we could roughly equate these roles as Percy being the leader, Tyson being the big guy, Grover being the heart, and Annabeth is kind of a combination of the lancer and the smart guy. In Harry Potter, these roles could loosely be said to go something like Harry as the leader, Hagrid as the big guy, Neville as the heart, Ron as the lancer, and Hermione as the smart guy. I say loosely because Neville and Hagrid are treated more like secondary characters than part of the main cast. So it's true that Hermione and Annabeth both share the same narrative role as the smart guy, but Annabeth also being the Lancer adds something to her character that Hermione lacks. Again, I have to make a distinction between badass movie Hermione and book Hermione. Book Hermione is very intelligent and intellectually curious, but when it comes down to a life and death situation, she tends to flounder under the weight of her own nerves. Consider the scene in The Philosopher's Stone when she remembers that Devil Snare hates sunlight, but doesn't think to use her wand to create fire because she's so anxious. Her skills kind of fly out the window in the heat of the moment, and she's not very good at translating her knowledge into a combat strategy. Hermione may have intelligence, but she lacks cunning. She's not good at thinking on her feet or coming up with a story or plan. And at her heart, she is a rule follower, a goody two-shoes. It's rare and special when she determines breaking a rule is acceptable, and she only does this a handful of times in the entire series. Annabeth, on the other hand, isn't only a nerd who spends her time reading, she's also a warrior who eats, sleeps, and breathes strategy. Annabeth isn't perfect, she makes mistakes and has blind spots, and she usually needs some help in order to execute her plans, but she's pretty comfortable in a life and death situation. There's a reason why, in Heroes of Olympus, the other 7 demigods of the prophecy see her as their leader rather than Percy or Jason. She lacks special powers or abilities, but she's really good at knowing exactly where and how other people should use their abilities. She's not the most skilled fighter in the cast, but she's very good at getting out of a dangerous situation using her mind rather than a weapon. She is cunning and good at thinking up a lie when necessary. She's good at identifying what makes people tick and using that to achieve her goals. Rather than following rules to the letter, she finds ways to work within them to succeed when possible and breaks rules that get in her way. Annabeth exists in a world where there aren't adults you can turn to fix a problem or ask for help. Demigods more or less have to depend on themselves in order to survive, and she rises to the occasion over and over again. Another major difference between these two characters is the way in which their friends interact with them. When Hermione educates Harry and Ron about something, they usually get annoyed or just disregard her, calling her a nag or a know-it-all frequently, despite the fact that they are her closest friends. Annabeth, conversely, isn't listened to by everyone. For example, Clarice and Luke often ignore or belittle her, but her friends actually respect and listen to her because they know her well enough to know that she's usually right. Percy and Grover depend on her in similar ways to Harry and Ron's dependence on Hermione, but they openly admit to doing this and give her credit for all that she does. You get the sense from Percy that he considers Annabeth his equal and a valued team member, not a sidekick. You could argue that the Harry Potter portrayal is more accurate to how intelligent women are treated in real life, but I do think the way Annabeth is portrayed is more empowering, which is Rick's modus operandi. Annabeth also has her own dreams distinct from Percy's. Aside from wanting to test her mettle as a monster fighter, her dream of becoming an architect is tied in directly with her personality and background. Because of her unstable and neglectful childhood, as well as her tumultuous and short-lived friendships, Annabeth wants to build something that will last for generations. Her dreams are portrayed as an interesting part of her personality, with her friends often thinking about Annabeth whenever they come across a famous building or monument. For example, when Thalia, Grover, and Percy arrive at Hoover Dam in the Titan's Curse, they spout off a bunch of facts about it that they learned from Annabeth. Her interest in architecture is seen as a quirk, but also as a piece of what makes her who she is. At the end of the first series, Annabeth is recruited by the Olympian Council to repair and redesign parts of Olympus that were damaged in the Titan War. The fact that Riordan chose to weave in personal success stories for both Annabeth and Grover, to me shows that he was equally as interested in their personal arcs as he was in Percy's. Compare this to the way Hermione's ambitions are viewed by those around her within her story, and it's a stark contrast. In The Goblet of Fire, Hermione begins taking interest in securing civil rights for house elves, and this is viewed with irritation and frustration by everyone around her. Admittedly, she doesn't go about working for this in the best possible way, but the idea of even attempting this in any way is mocked or disregarded by everyone close to her, and nobody really offers her any support or assistance. After finishing her education, Hermione is supposed to have gone to work at the Ministry to further her goals, but since this doesn't appear anywhere in the actual texts of the book, books, it does feel like her personal ambitions weren't considered very important to the author. It's pretty clear to me that these two girls are actually very different people. Beyond their narrative role as the smart one and similar narrative circumstances as the one who often saves the protagonist's life, they don't have much in common at all. If you go into the Percy Jackson books intending to compare these two, or just see them as the same character, you're going to end up not seeing Annabeth clearly for the person that she is, and miss all the character development in her arc. I could write an entire essay just about Annabeth, but that's not what we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about the Percy Jackson series. So let's dive into the actual story itself next. Part 3. The Story. A lot of people point to the basic story structure of PJO as being a ripoff of the Potter formula. In the first pentology and its accompanying materials, the story structure is generally something like this. It opens at the start of school break, usually summer, sometimes winter. Some kind of confrontation or fight happens. Percy eventually arrives at camp, and then Percy or a friend of his receives a prophecy from the Oracle of Delphi, which results in a group of people going on a quest to accomplish some goal or defeat some person. And at the end, they return back to camp for a while before Percy returns home for the school year. In Harry Potter, there's also a repetitive story structure that goes something like this. It opens at the end of summer break. Harry usually has some family drama. He spends some time with a friend from the magical world, usually Ron. He goes to Hogwarts. He and his friends figure out some kind of mystery, which enables Harry and sometimes his friends to face some kind of climactic conflict. And at the end, Harry goes home for the summer. Now, prophecies don't play a huge role in the individual stories, but there's that one prophecy about Harry and Voldemort that kind of sets up the entire series, so a lot of people name the prophecy stuff as a similarity between the two, even though the existence of the prophecy isn't even mentioned until book 5, whereas they're central to the plot of every Percy Jackson book. So I can see why, looking at this list, you might go, see? It's just a blatant ripoff of Harry Potter. It's got almost the same formula, but there's a couple problems with taking this perspective. For one thing, basically all children's book series have some kind of reliable formula. For instance, The Chronicles of Narnia has a formula that goes something like child protagonists somewhere in England. The children find their way into Narnia through some magic portal. Once there, the children embark on adventures during which they aid the citizens of Narnia in some way. Eventually, they defeat some kind of evil or malevolent force, and at the end they are returned to their own world at the exact moment they left it. There are some exceptions, like The Horse and His Boy and The Last Battle, but the other 5 books in the series all follow this formula, which is not all that far off from either Percy or Harry's formula. Another problem is the fact that the Percy formula also shares a lot in common with the basic structure of most ancient Greek myths. Think about how those stories generally play out. There's usually some kind of problem or conflict which causes someone to go seek wisdom from the Oracle of Delphi. The prophecy they receive then sets off a chain of events leading to that prophecy's fulfillment, and depending on who you are in the story, that could work out either good or bad for you. The prophecy that Perseus would kill his grandfather is shitty for the grandpa, but Perseus ends up fine by the end of the story. Prophecy that Metis's children would one day overthrow Zeus was really shitty for Metis, but it worked out alright for Athena, who was born as a result of that prophecy and became one of the most important gods in the pantheon. Also, lots of the plot elements in Harry Potter are basically just reworked from ancient mythologies and religions. I mean, it's about a baby who is prophesied to save the world, and he achieves this by sacrificing himself, raising from death, and then killing Voldemort. I don't know about you, but that all sounds very familiar for some reason. You could also make the argument that Harry Potter is a classic Greek tragedy if you look at it from the perspective of Voldemort. He hears of a prophecy telling of his downfall, and all his attempts to thwart the prophecy ultimately end up causing his downfall. If he had never heard the prophecy and never targeted Harry, then his downfall probably would not have come and he'd be ruling the world right now. He effectively takes the role of Perseus's grandfather, ensuring his own death by his attempts to thwart it. Seeing as both Harry Potter and Percy Jackson share a lot of the same source material, it's not unreasonable that they would share some cosmetic similarities. And this reality was pointed out by Uncle Rick himself in a blog post he wrote way back in 2005. Did I get some ideas from Harry Potter? In the sense that I am working with the same patterns, toying with the same mythology, doing variations on the same centuries-old themes, yes. But Percy Jackson is not Harry Potter. nor is Harry Potter where the ideas originated. This notion that Percy Jackson is a knockoff of Harry Potter presupposes that Harry Potter is original in the first place, but that isn't the case. It's kind of like when the Hunger Games came out and everyone called it a ripoff of Battle Royale, when the notion of sending children into an inescapable death trap was not original to Battle Royale. Theseus and the Minotaur covers the idea of a monarch forcing the sacrifice of children's lives, and the historical gladiator games were literal battles to the death for entertainment. There's only so many ideas in the world, and that means sometimes people will come up with ideas that overlap with the ideas someone else also independently came up with. The real kicker, though, is that Percy Jackson and Harry Potter don't even share the same themes. Harry Potter is a pretty straightforward good versus evil story, with admittedly somewhat more nuance than in many fantasy stories. Like, sure, there's a struggle between the Order and the Death Eaters, but there's also the social and political struggles within the wizarding community. Is Cornelius Fudge good or evil? Is Rita Skeeter? Not everything fits into a neat category. Still, the overall story is about having the courage to boldly stand up against the forces of evil and those who are complicit in supporting them. Percy Jackson isn't about good versus evil, but it tricks you into thinking it is. At first you think it's a struggle between the gods and the titans, but then you realize that both the gods and the titans are terrible, just in different ways. Really what the story is about is empathy, kindness, and forgiveness even for one's enemies. Percy may be biased against the titans, but over the course of the story he comes to empathize with a lot of them and can admit that many were wronged and had understandable reasons to rebel. In the sequel series, Percy comes to have empathy for the monsters who always attack him too. He never considered that maybe the reason they're always attacking demigods is because demigods have been hunting and murdering them for millennia even when they've minded their own business. Percy's whole MO is to allow people the space and opportunity to do better rather than just punishing people who have wronged you. In Percy Jackson, evil is something people do, not something people are, and they can almost always turn over a new leaf and set things right. In my last video, I talked about how I believe that Percy Jackson has a deeper theme criticizing Western imperialism and colonialism. The Olympians are depicted as a kind of imperial force, where only the main 12 and their children are considered important or worthy, and the rest of the pantheon are marginalized and their children are ignored and neglected. The oppressive force is depicted as systemic and far-reaching. When Percy forces the gods to accept and respect all the children of the gods at the end, he's effectively rejecting the imperial system that Olympus has sustained for thousands of years. In Harry Potter, the whole blood purity mania is basically a matter of interpersonal prejudice, until the final book in which these prejudices are ingrained in the government, when the Death Eaters place the Minister of Magic under mind control. It doesn't really ever explain exactly why the Death Eaters or people like Umbridge came to have their opinions about blood purity beyond a caricature of pure hatred and supremacy, and the prejudice is mainly a pretext for world domination. The only character whose prejudice is explored in any depth in the text is Voldemort, who is canonically born cruel and heartless. None of this is at all similar to the way bigotry actually works in the real world. I guess you could argue that both series broadly include themes of rejecting prejudice, but one thing I appreciate about Percy Jackson that isn't the case in Harry Potter is that in PJO, most of the protagonists themselves have to confront their own prejudices at one point or another. Percy, Annabeth, Thalia, and Grover all have some form of prejudice that they must overcome, whether it's against Cyclopes, Titans, or other demigods. In Harry Potter, it's really only Ron who has prejudices that are depicted as needing to be overcome, like with giants and house elves. Harry also has prejudices, particularly against Slytherins, but this is more or less portrayed as a valid position in the story by Slytherins being evil, and Hermione seemingly has no prejudices at all. Maybe Harry Potter is against the narrative of blood purity, but it's uninterested in addressing prejudice more broadly. So, if we look past some of the more basic cosmetic similarities between these stories, what we actually have are two very different tales about very different characters trying to impart very different messages. Both stories have magic, both feature trios of children who work together, and both deal with the problem of prejudice to some extent. But the details reveal so many differences that it's no surprise that the only thing equally as common as people claiming the two stories are exactly the same is people claiming they have absolutely no idea why people think these two stories are the same. difficult in this era to make a video talking about Harry Potter without mentioning the elephant in the cupboard under the stairs that is Miss Rowling. She's been facing a lot of heat lately for her anti-trans views, which she has been proud to share loudly and often. Rowling herself holds that she is not transphobic, but is merely concerned about the rights of cisgender women, and as a cis woman, I've gotta say, there are many areas in which I feel my rights are actively being threatened in the current political climate, but trans people do not make the top 10 concerns for me. In fact, they don't make the list at all, and I'm not alone in that opinion. Despite the anti-trans rhetoric consuming the UK in recent years, there are many Harry Potter fans who felt betrayed and hurt by these revelations about a woman they'd grown up idolizing and admiring. And for some people, the betrayal ran deep enough that they could not enjoy Harry Potter anymore and didn't feel comfortable giving it to their children as they'd always planned. For some of these people, turning to Percy Jackson has been able to help fill a void left by Harry Potter for several reasons. Firstly, it shares enough cosmetic similarities with Harry Potter to inspire a similar feeling of excitement, adventure, and wonder. Second, it's different enough that it allows you to fall in love with new characters and stories. And third, it was written with the express purpose of empowering all children exactly the way they are. And it has an author committed to holding to that ethos. When given the chance to add 6 new main characters to the story, he wrote 5 young people of color. When given the chance to expand on the characters he'd already written, he took the chance to give them diverse sexualities and gender identities. And he wasn't afraid to portray the real-world experiences of prejudice and discrimination within his magical world, whether it be for racial and sexual minorities, women, non-Olympian gods, or monsters. No matter who you are, you can probably find at least one character in the story to identify with in a big way. It's really excellent children's literature, and I'm glad that people are finally giving it the credit that it deserves. Riordan has not escaped the Potter legacy, and it's uncertain if he ever will. But after all these years, people are finally giving it an assessment on its own merits and noting its unique features, rather than just picking out all the things vaguely similar to the Wizard School book. Rather than being stuck in Harry's shadow, Percy is slowly but surely becoming his equal, or at least his descendant, so to speak. It's undeniable that the far-reaching impact of Harry Potter on children's literature and pop culture in general will leave a mark for decades, and it's very possible that no other pop culture phenomenon will ever reach the same level of success again within my lifetime. But I'm hopeful that Percy Jackson will find its own place within the pop culture pantheon that I believe it so truly deserves.